Hello.
Hi.
So, welcome everyone to Faith Arts. As you all know, as members of Faith Arts, my name is Lorenda Harder, creator of Faith Arts, an artist, and a poet. Our special guest today here is Steve Turner, and he's hailing from London, England right now. And we both have our cups of tea with us as
Oh,
I
yeah, mine's
promised.
on the floor. Yeah.
And he is, thank you, he is author of this book that we've been looking at all year, Imagine, and a Vision for Christians in the Arts. And we've really enjoyed it a lot. So welcome, Steve.
Okay. Thank you for having me.
Well, I found your book incredibly insightful and timely, even though it wasn't written yesterday, and comprehensive. And it really speaks to artists across the disciplines, which fits perfectly with our vision at Faith Arts, where we aim to integrate creativity. Uh, with our and faith into our ministry, and with our personal faith in Jesus Christ at the center. Um,
Yeah.
you and we're doing that especially amid this crazy today's postmodern, post-Christian, basically skepticism. And so there are a lot of things to navigate through. So our interest today will touch on a lot of things: truth and imagination, integrating our natural and our spiritual giftings. Considering how our natural and spiritual gifts can overlap and layer, and the difference between them, and also how cultural shifts influence our churches, and how and it'll be a time at the end to receive all kinds of advice from you. So whatever you want to share with us, it would be great. But first, I just want to know a little bit more about uh, you after I give you the official introduction, because even though we've been following you, I think there's always so much more to learn about you.
Okay.
Oh, here's what I grabbed off of LinkedIn and wherever I could. So Steve Turner has covered pop culture for a few decades now, and he's interviewed iconic figures including Paul McCartney and Bono of U2. He's written for major publications including The Times, Guardian, Rolling Stone, and has interviewed iconic figures such as Bono of U2 and Paul McCartney. I mentioned that already. I guess I'm excited about that. I'd imagine your interview with Paul fed into your best-selling book, A Hard Day's Right, which were stories behind every Beatles song. Yeah, and then other writings include numerous biographies such as Van Morrison, Marvin Gaye, I mean, all kinds of people, right? More
Mhm.
recently, another bestseller in another direction, which caught my eye, was The Day I Fell Down the Toilet for kids. And
Yeah.
so we're going to ask you about that later too. So Hugh, now I need to kind of catch my breath and build my courage to interview such a seasoned and successful interviewer as yourself. So that I'm so glad you're here with us today. And so to begin, what I'd really like to do is ask you a little bit about, sorry, what you're doing now and how you're spending your time these days.
These days, I mean, I guess, yeah, during the COVID period, I got down to writing quite a few things, which I'm just sort of finishing off. A couple of poetry books, one for another one for children, which is about a castle. Um, one adult poetry book, which is my response to Ecclesiastes. And then I've done a book on the influence of the Beat Generation on rock music. And I've also done a memoir. So all those books are really finished, and I need to. Well, I'm trying to get people to give me blurbs for the back cover, which would also help publishers become interested in the books, in the manuscripts, and trying to chase publishers, agents, however you get your books out. Because normally I mean, I suppose in what I would call the old days, you just used to have an idea. Maybe you'd call somebody you knew at a publisher's and say, well, I've got this idea for a book on X, Y, Z. And then they say, great, because you sort of write it up on an A4 piece of paper and you give it to them, and then they'd commission you. It was very quick process, and it was very personal. But now it's much more laborious, and everybody, publishers don't want to talk to you unless you've got an agent. Agents don't want to talk to you unless you've been recommended to them, and it's quite a complicated process.
Oh, I'll bet you've seen the industry change so much over the years. So it's good to hear actually that it's hard for you too to get it
Yeah,
all going, because it's very difficult for writers now to get their heads around all
sure.
the changes in
Yeah,
getting it into production. And
yeah.
all the best to you, and I'll be keeping an eye open out for some of those
Right,
things.
thank you. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And now before we kind of dive deep into the arts and spirituality, could you just kind of think back to your childhood and maybe share with us how your family or friends or other influences sparked your interest in the arts in the first place? And then specifically when you decided to become a writer and how that came up.
Right. Well, my parents weren't they weren't involved in the arts. My dad was a radio engineer for the BBC, but when it was I mean, if the sun was shining, we'd go and play in the garden when we were kids, and we had quite a big garden. Uh, but when it wasn't sunny, if it was raining, Mum would get out paper and pencils and pens and crayons and a paint box, and we would I've got two sisters and a brother, and we would just sort of make things. I'd make a poster. I'd make a little comic, with little comic strips in, and Mum kept all these things, and I think that gave me a sense of that these things were to be valued. It made me feel that I was doing something important that she cherished. And she kept them all through her life, and then passed them on to us. So, and I can remember seeing pictures in encyclopedias. Like there was a portrait called "The Laughing Cavalier" by Frans Hals, a Dutch painter, and it was of a cavalier who had a big black hat and a little beard, and he had a ruffle around his neck, a lace ruffle. And it just fascinated me how an artist with paint could do something as intricate as lace, and turn it into a picture. So I would try and copy this picture and make it look like what I saw on the page. So I had that sort of inclination to want to make things, some things with words, illustrations, whatever. And so that was a sort of valuable part. I always read. I'd read books late at night in bed, and it's going to be firework night in November the 5th in England, and I can hear the fireworks going off in the background. So if you hear any knocking sounds, it's fireworks. It's also Diwali, so it's a combination of events that involve fireworks. Really, my coming to poetry really happened in 1965. It was on Bonfire Night in 1965 that I knew there was this poetry reading coming up in London, and I hitchhiked up to London with my friend, and we went to this poetry reading, and there was a Buddhist monk read some stuff, and then there was a young student who read poems of William Blake, actually from the Songs of Innocence and Experience, and I was quite taken with this. With the poems and the fact that somebody could read these poems and that they affected me emotionally. I thought, I'd love to do that. And that's when I started writing my own poems. And it was 3 years later that I actually got up and read them in a pub in a town called Northampton. My dad came across this listing in the local newspaper and said, "Oh, look, there's a poetry reading happening every fortnight in this pub in Northampton." And so I went along. I had some stuff, but I wasn't confident enough to read it first of all. And the guy said, "Do you want to read?" And I go, "Yeah." And I'll do it next week. And then he'd ask me next week. And I say, "Oh no, I've forgotten them this week." And it just went on until it was actually early 1968 that I actually stood up and read my poems. And that sort of gave me this feeling of writing for an audience who you could see before you. And if you wrote a funny poem and you saw these people in front of you and they didn't laugh, and clearly it wasn't a funny poem. And or if you're trying to make them, reflective and they were fidgeting or whatever. So it was really good to have this audience sort of within a few feet of you, sort of responding to your poems. And so even when I'm writing now, I imagine an audience, like you know what it's like to get up and read. Like I would assume if somebody's a minister and they know how congregations react to their words, I'm sure even when they're writing their sermons that they anticipate this audience that they're going to be addressing in the future. So that the poems were my first form of writing, and I had this sort of dream as a teenager that I would do different forms of writing. Maybe I'd write a novel, I'd write nonfiction, I'd write a play, whatever. But the first thing I wrote that wasn't poetry was was an article about the Beatles for the Beatles fan magazine, and I sent this off to the fan magazine and didn't think I'd hear anything. But the next thing I heard was that it had been published and enclosing a check. So wow, and the check was about the same amount I would get for a week's work normally. So that really started me on my career as a journalist, because the guy that ran this fan magazine also ran another magazine called Beat Instrumental, which is a sort of general magazine about rock music. And he said, if you want to contribute to that, then fine. So in 1970, there's a school like immediately opposite our house, and they had this new group playing there, and they were called Black Sabbath. And I went and interviewed these guys in the school cloakroom, and that was the first article I ever wrote. Then I did Mark Bolan from T-Rex, and then I did Rod Stewart, and the magazine liked my stuff so much they offered me a job. So that's how I started full-time writing. Yeah.
That's wonderful. That's
Yeah.
wonderful. Okay, a couple of things about that, what you just said. Like, it was wonderful that you received some, maybe not verbally, but you still received encouragement with
Yeah.
the arts and the value of the arts. And I did too, personally. But then sometimes in our limited minds, we start reading into things. And so for myself, I read into that verse, 2 Corinthians 10:5, where it said, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth
Yeah.
itself against the knowledge of God. And I read that like imagination was wrong. And
Oh,
so the real split that happened to me, I didn't understand the biblical meaning of that, obviously. And so I think it's wonderful that you just naturally flowed, your art naturally flowed and developed into, the poetry and expressing yourself there, and how beautifully too you received this opportunity to start attaching money to what you do, that
yeah.
you were
Yeah.
to make a living at it. So I've got a couple of questions. First of all, in your experience, how do you find that biblical misunderstandings or a lack of biblical insight can impact artists, their lives, and their ministries? And I'll ask you the other question later.
Well, the verse you just quoted, I mean, I took not at the time I was first writing for Beat Instrumental, but I later came to see that as, as part of your job as an artist is to cast down false idols. There were quite a few sort of quotes of a similar nature that Solzhenitsyn came up with. He used his fiction to expose corruption, dehumanization, all the things that were bad about Soviet society at that time. Yeah, there are. I mean, I suppose the archetypal verse for misunderstanding is the one that says, think on these things, whatsoever is good and lovely, blah, blah, blah. Meaning like, how could you possibly read that novel or watch that film or whatever? But, it's possible to have those standards in your mind by which you judge the novel. I mean, not every page is going to be glorious and truthful and loving and whatever, but you have to take a novel as a whole, or a writer's career as a whole. You can't just, imagine if somebody selected all the good and holy bits and threw the rest away. I mean, it wouldn't be. I think it's the arts in general. You're kind of entering a conversation, and society sort of wrestles with things, and it's often through the arts, probably first of all, that these things get dealt with, and then later on in newspapers, and later on in Parliament and political circles. But art wrestles with things, like films wrestle with, or science fiction, for example, deals with issues of the future long before it's debated in the Houses of Parliament or whatever. So there is this sort of conversation going on through poems, not as much as it should be, but poetry and songs, and people are thrashing things out, and you have to be willing to listen to what other people have to say. And maybe sometimes we put too much emphasis on, for example, beauty, when there is it's a difficult concept, but I mean, there's beauty in ugliness sometimes, like rust, and I've often taken photos of doors. I love doors, old doors, broken doors, rusting doors, whatever, they're fascinating. And there is a sort of beauty even in a door that's cracked, and it tells a sort of story that somebody's lived here, somebody's loved the building or whatever, and the passing history. Not like seeing someone with a very lined face or whatever. You don't say, oh, that's worthless, that's ugly. You look at the dignity in the person.
Yeah, for sure.
And the danger of people that only want to see beauty is they just want to paint daffodils all the time.
Yeah, it ends up making their whole work look fairly saccharine then, and not the reality isn't there.
Yeah,
Like,
it's not the world most people
life.
are in.
Yeah,
No,
yeah.
no.
That's really, you paint a much grander picture of the arts than I think a lot of artists have. I think sometimes artists of all kinds can just become kind of myopic, like kind of look inside, like what is my purpose of expressing? But just I know that in Imagine you discuss the playfulness in art and how
Yeah,
creating itself has an intrinsic value.
yeah, yeah.
And so as an artist, like, you create, you integrate your faith with creative expression. It sounds quite naturally. You're there. Seems to me like there's quite an honesty. But what if you what if you had not have received the monetary value to that writing, for example? What do you say to the artists that struggle all their lives and like they're just poor
Right.
money on it?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. I suppose one of the most difficult things I've faced is like, how do you, well, monetize would be the word people use these days. How do you monetize the thing that you love to do? Because art doesn't always pay, especially if you're trying to stick with a particular vision. Um, I mean, some people, for example, make films, and they would more or less go out and interview the public and say, what do you want to see? And then they go out and make that film. But I don't think we're in that sort of game, really. I mean, yes, you've got to consider what people are thinking, and how you communicate what you think into that culture, but not to be driven by the changing tastes of culture. Because
Right.
often people, success can be very short-lived if they just go for what the public likes at this minute, and then when the public changes, then they're sort of cut adrift a bit. But for
Right, right.
example, I've written this memoir, and my book about the Beat Generation. So I've not had any advances for those things. I've just done them off my own back because I thought they're a bit difficult to explain to people. So I just thought you can't give somebody 2 or 3 pages and say this is what the book's going to be about. 'Cause in one way, I don't even know what the book's going to be about until I start digging deep and researching. But it's a subject that fascinates me, and I think a worthwhile book can be written about it. And you hope it will make money in order to give you a living and look after your family and all that sort of thing. But I do find that one of the toughest things, because sometimes people will look at Van Gogh and say, well, he never sold a painting in his whole life or whatever. I'm not sure what's true, but he wasn't very successful during his lifetime, but it's wildly successful since he died. And so they think if they're rejected, then they are like Van Gogh. But sometimes people, maybe some people don't have the talent, and they should respond to criticism a bit more
Yeah.
willingly, because it's I sometimes hear people sing songs and you think, you just haven't got it, and then you hear another person, you think they've got it, hard to put your finger on what it is. But after interviewing so many people, it's probably, maybe it's a bit distorted, because the people I would interview would obviously be successful, otherwise I wouldn't be interviewing them. Nobody would know about them. So you can think these people sort of believed in themselves and therefore they've become successful. But not everybody who believes, I mean, we've all met people who believe in themselves incredibly, but are probably just not cut out for the art form they've chosen or the business they want to go in.
Yeah, that's so
But
true.
it is, I think it is a difficult thing. I guess we think about Christians becoming artists, but we also would be good if Christians became agents and editors at publishing houses and art gallery curators and things like that. Not that they would totally favour Christians, that wouldn't be the right thing to do, but they would have a sensitivity towards
Right.
Christians, and maybe would you could call them up and they'd say, well, I can't do it, but I know somebody over here that could do it. Or theatre impresarios, or film directors, or theatre directors, things like that. There's a lot of gatekeeper jobs that it would be great if Christians were involved in.
Yeah, that's so true. Your chapter on the mind, right? With the
Mm.
concentric circles
Oh
too.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
pretty intriguing. If you could just like remind us about that concept, and then also bring in like the dualism that can happen when we tend to separate our no, you know what? Maybe it's too much, but I'll give it to you and we'll see
Yeah.
how it goes. Separating our when we try to separate our spiritual gifts, like maybe administration, right, from expressing ourselves in our area of art. Like when we don't just we're not just living holistically, right, as Christians with our gifts and using those gifts and using our natural gifts together, we tend sometimes to separate those. Now, of course, the spiritual gifts are going to benefit the church more directly because that's what the spiritual gifts are for, but it's not like we stop using them in our
Mm.
lives, right? And with you, you've never like you very rarely kind of preach directly, right, to people. You are living your life and your testimony, and like
Right.
you hope that they see the truth. You hope that you see the hope that you have, right, in your story. And so if you have anything to say about the mind and the circles and uh
Yeah. I can't exactly remember all the circles, uh, I mean, what I was trying to say was, I mean, people tend to think if you were a Christian film director or something, like you may have a chance to make a film about the crucifixion or the birth of the church or something, but you don't, because a lot of times you might be making a film about a family breakup or something like that, but that's doesn't mean that your story about the family breakup isn't affected by this central thing that you believe, and the sort of energy of the central thing that you believe in sort of affects all the areas. So you were talking earlier about being playful with, say, for example, language. Um, that's just that's a gift that God's given us. I mean, there are lots of sort of puns and wordplay in the Bible. I mean, not to strengthen a point particularly, but there's just a playfulness attached to words, just as dancing. There are many things in life that don't seem to have any particularly great purpose other than enjoyment of life. And like I've written poems for children, and there you tend to be playful because children love mucking around with language, you know. And I've just got my first grandchild who's 18 months, and I mean, I know things that excite her just about language and words and repeating phrases and stuff like that, which is a great thing. And if you're trying to write for children, you play with that, and it's just you know, there's not an opportunity to say, and Jesus died for your sins or something like that. It's um, just this great gift of language and of words, which is a vital gift, and it's the way God speaks to most of us is through language in some form or other. And so, just to delight in language and play with it is great.
And that's wonderful. You know, you talk, oh, pardon.
I think, but the thing is, yeah, I mean, the more you hope, the more you're kind of saturated in Christian thinking and biblical thinking, that will sort of by osmosis will get into all your work and the way you see things and the way you choose who to work with and who not to work with, and you're always kind of selecting, aren't you? As you, I mean, there's some people I wouldn't want to write a whole book about because I think is, you know, their lives that sort of vital? Has it got a big lesson for everybody? But I would certainly have a meal with them or maybe do an interview with them. You know, I'd be happy to interview Ozzy Osbourne, for example, but I wouldn't choose him to write a whole book about because the people I choose to write whole books about, there's something about their lives where they're asking the big questions. You know, so I write about Van Morrison or the Who or even the Beatles. I mean, people that ask sort of questions, I feel like I can sort of support their questioning. But somebody who is not interested in questioning, I'm less interested in. That's just who I am, I guess.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. And you know, like you're sharing about the message and how, you know, how when people are wanting to talk about big stories like and like, you know, philosophy and
Mm.
spirituality, and then of course that engages you more
Yeah.
and you want to go down that road. And now my question is, you know, I think you've answered the question that I don't think the message of Christ has to be clear in every work of art and every writing and every
Oh.
poem. It just has to be a part of your life. But I'm wondering about those Christians who start really getting into their expressions and they claim that their work is like special revelation from God. Do you have any thoughts on those people who feel like they have special revelation? What is your definition of that and your thoughts on that?
um, I who did I hear recently? I think it was the American preacher John MacArthur. He said, I can't think of a time when I could say, you know, God came to me and told me this or told me to say that." And I find it's very rare that you actually. I mean, there are sometimes, but it's very rare. But for songwriters, for example, to go around saying, you know, God gave me this song, which kind of puts it beyond criticism. You say, well, you know, he didn't write it, God wrote it and gave it to him. But then when I read ordinary songwriters and musicians, and I guess painters and all different sorts of art, they've all had that experience of feeling that some work that they've just completed was completed elsewhere and kind of delivered to them. I think that's a very common experience.
Yeah,
So,
well, yeah, I differentiate like that sense of transcendence as
mm,
different than when somebody actually claims that they have a special message from God,
yeah,
or
yeah, yeah.
there seems to be a difference there. And I don't know if you can add any thoughts to that or
Well,
disagree.
if you're not a Christian and you come up with a good idea, you just say, "I came up with a good idea." Like
Yeah.
Keith Richards said, he woke up with the riff for this song that became Satisfaction. He woke up in a motel and it was in his head, and he had a tape recorder by his bed, and he just kind of, I don't know if he played it or hummed it or something. But that's all they say. Like, and most artists have experiences like that where something came sort of fully fledged to them. But if you're a Christian, then you say it was God that gave me. But that adds another level where it becomes. I mean, Keith Richards not saying the song is beyond criticism because it came to him, and you know, when he was half asleep. But if a Christian came up with something, they would say God gave it to me, and if He made a lot of money for them and set
Yeah,
them
yeah,
up for
but
their
wait a
career,
minute. I would then tend to say, don't label it like that.
yeah,
Don't
yeah,
like, I mean,
yeah,
I don't think it's accurate. I think we have to be careful what we
yeah,
label,
absolutely,
right? I mean,
yeah,
I think there's something so precious and beautiful about the arts that it doesn't need to
no, no,
it doesn't need acknowledgement from like a special stamp from
no,
God, right?
no,
Like I I think where you're going with your sharing too is like whatever we produce, it's art and we can get better at it. We might be going down the wrong road if we're not getting
yeah,
success. We might, we don't know that, but the importance of us um, just continuing to express who we are. So make sure
yeah,
that we are the people we want to be, like we're focused on the Lord, right?
yeah,
Then then it, like you said, by osmosis, like it will naturally come out. So I think
yeah.
that's really good. Let's shift now a little bit
Well,
to
most arts, it seems to me that it most often comes from like two different areas of your life or your thought, which you thought had nothing to do with each other. They suddenly come together, and there's like a sort of a flash. You go, well, yeah, that's like that. Well, boom. And it's just because you've never associated these two things. It's novel, and it has that feeling of that you've been gifted with this idea, with this connection. But as I say, I think it's not divorced from God, because if God hadn't made us with creative minds, then satisfaction wouldn't have been written, and yesterday wouldn't have been written, and all these things. So it's part of God's imprint in our being that we are creative and that we enjoy being creative. You know, we I mean, I sometimes write poems and I look at them and I can't believe I wrote it. You know, did I write that? And I read it as if it was almost somebody else's work. You know, but I think that is again part of the just the delight of being a human being.
yeah.
And you know, maybe at the end of your life, or maybe in heaven, you'll find out which ones were delivered by God for some particular reason. Otherwise, you know, all Christians would be creating absolutely stunning paintings and wonderful poems and beautiful songs all the time, and that's clearly not true.
That's true. But I have too. I'm a poet as well, and I've sometimes something will come out, and I've worked on it, and I've rewritten it 30 times. But then when I go, "Oh, it's done now," and I read it, I almost forget, like a year later, if I read it, like how it hits my soul still. I mean, I
Mm,
can end up crying about it all over again,
mm,
as though I hadn't written it. And so I find poetry can be very healing. Um,
yeah.
Wow. So, yeah. So if we can shift now and just talk a little bit about the cultural shifts in our, especially the last 20 years or so, and how that's affected the local church, positive and negative. Do you have any ideas on that?
How shifts in the culture have affected local churches.
The shifts in the culture influencing our approaches to art and our understanding of, of how art is going to be integrated into the churches.
Right. I mean, a lot of times I don't find art integrated into churches at all. I mean, music is the only art that gets sort of top billing in a church. They'll have worship leaders and they'll have bands now. I mean, they didn't 30, 40 years ago, but that's kind of a new thing. No, I remember somebody saying to me years ago, "Oh, how does your church use your gift or something?" And I there wasn't really an answer to it, because they don't, you know.
There-
Which,
There's a real there's a real lack here. Let's
yeah,
like, you know, yeah. So in churches, like I'm starting to see a few inroads because I'm looking for them. There are a few churches that are opening up and really wanting to use visual art, Our church is starting to use poetry, right? Poetry readings, and trying to bring in certain of the arts as part of worship or just part of the culture of the church.
Right.
We now have a small art gallery in our church. A lot
Okay.
of Christians are running up against the problem where there's a lot of reticence. The leaders, the
Okay.
church leaders, just don't want to go there. And I'd love to know what your thoughts are on that and what we should be doing about it and what you would like to be telling the church leaders.
Um,
Go
yeah.
for it.
I mean, if there was a conference involving church leaders and artists, that might be fruitful in the sense of. I mean, I've come across preachers over the years that like poetry, for example, that have benefited from poetry, that would quote poems quite naturally in their sermons, and that's always good because when I started writing poetry, after I'd been at L'Abri in Switzerland, which was a kind of a learning community that Francis Schaeffer began in the 1950s. When they had their evening meals, in some of the chalets, there would be candles lit, and then like somebody may sing a song, or somebody would read from a book or share a poem, and I thought that I really liked that because I thought that's you want your art to be part of normal life. You'd want someone to write a letter to their boyfriend or girlfriend and include a poem that you'd written, because it expressed what they couldn't express or something like that. So to play a part in normal life, like in that way, not to be put on a pedestal and admired, but to actually have some useful function in people's lives. I'd like um, I mean, I mean, it'd be good to say to a preacher, for example, like, you could benefit from reading this book, and have you heard what this person said? Have you heard that song? You wouldn't want them to jam things into a sermon just to make it kind of topical. But there are some speakers that do it very naturally. They will naturally talk about a film, and then they talk about Homer's Odyssey, and then that's what I'd like best of all, if people had a whole kind of fabric of life that they could relate to a movie and to a song and to a painting and to architecture, whatever. It's just like a comprehensive view of the world.
Mhm.
But it's difficult if I'm not sure about if churches should run art galleries or poetry readings, or is that their function, or how would you curate it? If there was a lovely parishioner who did paintings, you'd find it hard to say, well, actually, it's not up to the standard we're trying to establish.
Yeah, I'm curating the small gallery, and
Okay.
that is a challenge. It is a challenge. There have to be like we used anonymous jurors so
Yeah.
that and also we don't give critiques unless it's asked for, but it
Okay.
can be tricky too. I mean, it takes a vulnerability in the
Yeah.
part of the artist to be willing to submit their work for this. But if they want to challenge themselves, there's also opportunity for learning skills because so our faith arts group, right? There are
Yeah.
artists, poets and writers and different various people willing to
Yeah.
mentor people along.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's a slow start. It's a I do find that music has sort of that's completely accepted um,
Yeah.
in the church. I think it's a natural thing, but I also think even culturally in like never mind the church, I think that visual arts, dance, um, uh, and some of those others, even drama, except for film, right, is sort of a hard sell. Like how to get somebody to go to a play, and how to if people say, "Well, I'm not into that. I'm not artistic," and so they think
Yeah.
that it's not a part of who they are. And so
Right.
I'm seeing it as like I like, you mentioned like getting people to read books, educating people, but I love that you mentioned too that you can't be jamming things down people's throats and the leader
No.
either it has to be from the heart, it has to be that they have to see a purpose in integrating the arts.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, one of the most useful things for me was when I came to London. The Arts Centre group was starting, and that was there's a guy called Nigel Goodwin who was who was a trained actor, and he wanted to have a space where artists could meet and share and listen to speakers and or hold exhibitions or whatever. And they got a place in Kensington, and then they moved down to Waterloo. And so each discipline, like the architects, the graphics people, the actors, artists, musicians, poets, journalists, they all had their own kind of groups. And then you'd have an arts festival and everybody would mingle together. And that was great because I would always know somebody who was a photographer. They went to the Art Centre group, well, I've got a book coming out and I need a picture for the back jacket. Could you do it? Somebody else does cartoons. It was great. I knew all these people in all these different disciplines. I heard them talk about problems that they face, that were unique to their particular art form. Like, actors obviously, like, should I play an adulterer in a stage play? I remember a girl that was very good illustrator doing book jackets, and she was told to take the Adam's apple out of people, because it sort of protruded too much, and she thought that was, people have them. Why should you be hiding them? But that was particular to her sort of form of illustration, and it was just interesting to hear people talk about these different things. And then we also went up to the Edinburgh Festival, which happens every year, and they formed a group called Upstream and put on a play. I read poetry, had musicians, had a mime artist, and we were just part of what was available at the festival, but we were all Christians, So that was a great sort of experience.
I think, like, honestly, you just gave me another idea. My friends and family are going to say, no, you don't have to act on that idea. But anyway, here's a neat idea. And you said like an arts festival, not a Christian arts festival, but just an arts festival, but has certain values because these
Right,
days the arts has sort of disintegrated into rejecting traditional like beauty and balance and the elements and principles of writing, of drawing, of every, right? And so then you end up, there's a real disconnect between the
mm,
basic core beliefs of what makes art beautiful. But if there was an arts group that started just to support all the arts, never mind like Christian arts, just support the arts and really promote truth and beauty,
yeah,
being honesty too, ugly things too, right? And imagination, and just really celebrating that with standards rather
mm,
than just a free for all, you know,
sure.
might be an idea. Like one of my last questions regarding the cultural shifts here was, do you believe Christian artists are more visible and impactful today than they were 20 years ago? And that's where, I was thinking this is a way, we could get into the culture and just be ourselves with a
Right,
different view. So, for example, with recent films like The Jesus Revolution, reaching mainstream audiences, it's not necessarily high art, but well, I really personally liked it. But it was really resonating with evangelicals. Do you see Christians more prominently influencing the arts than in 2001? Or do they have new avenues or influence, visibility, anything like that?
um, I think the difference I've seen is like when I like when I became a Christian, there was a sort of suspicion among Christians about, well, yes, suspicion also, like they didn't know how you addressed it. If you wanted to be a nurse or a doctor or I guess even banking, but in those professions it seemed to be just that's fine, there's just be a good Christian and get on with it. But if it when it came to the arts, I think there was a well, on the one hand, there was a tendency to think, well, artists deliver messages, therefore you should be delivering the gospel message, but like dressing it up in a way that's more acceptable to culture. Like they don't want to hear a preacher, but they don't mind seeing a movie. so you can kind of sneak the gospel in some way. Or there was a kind of fear that you'll get contaminated, you'll meet bad people, or you're going to be a musician, you'll end up as a drug addict or whatever. So best to play safe, and you'd hear these stories of people that had become Christians and they were a singer, and then praise the Lord, they gave it all up and became a missionary or something like that. That seemed to be, without saying don't get into music, they would tell a story about somebody who'd given it all up and now work for Billy Graham or something like that. So there was a sort of subtle message like this is a pretty dangerous area to get involved in. Then I think it kind of flipped, and then Christians felt no, as they today they don't feel any sort of compunction to like not play music or not be an actor or whatever, but they tend to get into these businesses and not make much difference at all. They get gradually kind of absorbed into it because either they don't know how to integrate their faith, or they seems to me that like they accept doing films that are not very helpful or not very sort of glorious, or that you kind of wonder what side they're on. If somebody's a strident feminist, for example, you would figure out what kind of movies they'd want to do, what kind of roles they would turn down, and people sort of admire them for it. They go, well, that person's a feminist, or that person's a gay activist or something, so they do that, but they wouldn't do that. But Christians sort of given the freedom to go and do, nothing wrong in being a painter, nothing wrong in being an actor, nothing wrong in being a poet. They tend not to have made such a huge impact. In my the way I see it, I see a lot of people like in music. They say, well, it starts off like, well, we're not a Christian band, we're not a church band, we're just a regular band, and then like 2 or 3 years later, you find there's not much difference at all, and that wasn't the idea in the first place. The idea we had was that we could be in the business not as evangelists, but there would be some difference that we would make just because we saw the world in a different way. I mean, it is, particularly in music, it can be very high pressure. People get a lot of adulation. How do you deal with it? Sometimes people get a lot of money. How do you deal with it? And it's very easy for people to not want to stand out too much,
Yeah. Yeah,
because
there
it's
seems to be a lot of motivation to not stand up, but I am seeing, at least in film, a lot of people are standing up and saying
okay.
things, and some of them are losing work over it, and
Okay.
some of them aren't. Um, but I just I I think it is really important that just because we're artists and Christian, that it may not be our if we don't have the gift of evangelism, that might not be the emphasis that
Mm,
we need to run. We don't need to go down that path, right?
mm,
And if we have the gift of encouragement in church, then how can we encourage? Sometimes our art will enter into that. And I would like it if church leaders could see that that's really important, that
mm.
that artist needs to be just recognized as a person and be able to be themselves,
Yeah.
express themselves naturally, but also in the culture, um, for us to see how best we can serve our culture, how best we can love them, right? And how can we effectively love them? It might not be painting a painting, it might be making a sandwich for someone, right? Like,
Sure. Yeah.
do you
Uh,
have anything else you'd like to add about any of the stuff we've talked about before I let you go off and write more poetry books?
well, when I like, as I say, this book that I've written recently it's about a particular castle in England, and I mean, with children, you you have to think like what appeals to children. You've really got two sources. One is like watching children, your own children or other children, observing them and listening to what they talk about and what they're interested in. And the other one is to look back at your own life and think, well, when I was a child, how did I feel? What was I interested in? And I did used to like castles, so I thought if I write a book about a castle, then there's got to be kids out there that would enjoy it. But then I thought, well, how do you write a book about a castle? Do you go from room to room, like the armory, the great hall, the tower? Or I ended up doing it by centuries because the castle I've based it on is like got 1,000 year history. So you do the 12th, 13th, 14th, all the different centuries. Then you've got these characters that emerge in those periods of time, and then um, there's things like, I mean, the castle has a chapel, so I could write about the chapel as a place of peace. But then when I write, I did one poem about um, who built the castle, and you always think, well, king somebody built it, queen somebody built it, but they didn't build it. It's the guys that lugged the rocks up the hill and had the carts and all that, and they're not celebrated because they were never painted. Nobody knows who they were, and so I felt that was that is a Christian look at work. The work ethic and the value of people and the value of building and stuff like that, and trying to give a little bit of attention and glory to the common people who actually built those castles. Who we don't know who they are. So it's not always by saying, Jesus died on the cross that you communicate the Christian message. It has to be it has to be pertinent to what you're talking about, and you've got to give it the right weight. If you're dealing normally with, armor and battles and things like that, and then Jesus has got to come in naturally if he comes in at all, because otherwise it will look like you kind of crowbarred him in, and people will go, what's that all about? When I'm doing my adult poems about Ecclesiastes, I mean, that's about, does life have meaning, and does death sort of undermine everything? There's much more chance to talk about big issues, and you don't have to apologize for it, because it fits very naturally. But it's like normal conversation. I mean, if you said something, how are you getting on? They say, oh, I've got a bit of a pain in my hip, and you talk about that. But if you suddenly said, well, did you know Jesus died for your sins? If it's not a progressive part of the conversation, people are just going to go, what? But if you spent an hour talking to the person, and something about church or something about belief came up, then you would naturally answer that question at the right time. But it's that sort of inappropriateness, I think you have. There might be somebody who says, well, gospel is always going to be inappropriate, people, it's the offense of the cross and all that. But I mean, there's a natural offense to the cross. You don't have to make it more offensive by your delivery.
That's wonderful. And you know what? We have time. I get to ask a question that popped into my head as you were.
Oh,
I wonder if you have any really awkward moments in your career, in your life, um, where it was a struggle with your faith and your art. Were there any moments where that was a struggle?
yeah. Trying to think. There's times when an agent approached me and said, it was known that Ozzy Osbourne wanted to tell his story, wanted to do a book. So whoever worked for Ozzy Osbourne were sort of sussing a few agents out to see if they could come up with a few names. So this agent wasn't the only one doing it, but she came to me and said, would I be interested? And I said I wouldn't be interested. Well, it'd pay very well if it came off. And I just said I don't have the kind of empathy for him. Like I said to you earlier, I'd be happy to interview him for a feature or something like that, but I wouldn't want to spend it like normally you spend about a year with writing a book about someone. It's like living with them for a year, and so you have to choose your subjects wisely because you're stuck with this person. And if there's something about them that you don't like, you'll start to feel angry about that person. Well, why did they not make that choice? Why did they do this? I guess think of that. I could probably come up with more answers if I thought more about it. I mean, so sometimes in the music industry, you can feel yourself getting sort of softened up, because when things feel sort of good and comfortable and people are nice to you, you can feel like, well, why rock the boat, right? Why say something that might sort of. So I probably spent more time. I know there were people, my contemporaries of mine that were writing about music. They really got into the lifestyle, and I think of one guy. I mean, he loved the Stones so much he would go on the road with them, and he would become like one of the band, or go on the road with Led Zeppelin, and they just become like one of the band, And I could see the appeal of that, but I could see the downfall of that as well. So I suppose it pushed me to take more of a detached look at things, like be an observer and not because like the guy I was mentioning with the Stones, I mean, he actually did become a heroin addict, So I knew this guy as a journalist, and then when I interviewed Keith Richards, I suddenly thought, he's just like this guy that I know. He walks in the same way. Everything about him is the same, and he obviously imitated Keith Richards to such an extent. But like you probably do lose certain opportunities because you're not that sort of close. But then, you wouldn't want them because of the cost of making choices like that would be too great.
Yeah.
Easy to become a hypocrite, and then you could undermine everything you've ever done.
Yeah, that's really great. It's a great observation. And I was just thinking too, and in all of life, right? Like as Christians, we are not, we're a part of this world, but it's not our home. And so
Yeah.
that detachment really, really ought to be in every area of our lives, including our art. So like not trying to lean in too hard to fit in,
Oh,
and to be aware of maybe the temptation to compromise,
yeah.
to put ourselves out there, be authentic, express ourselves freely, and make sure we're playing and enjoying parts of it, even if it's hard to do,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um, I would venture to say too, even if we're not making money at it, we can't all. Maybe that's just not what God had for us, or maybe we haven't found the path yet, or something like that. And
Yeah.
that our message is more about whatever comes out through osmosis after knowing the Lord, getting to know the Lord, being focused on the Lord, and then choose our art of choice, go for it, right? So
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
okay.
Um, yeah. I mean, sometimes people. I can remember my hairdresser saying, "Well, I can't imagine." He's not a Christian, but he said if he became a Christian, he can't imagine going to a sort of a hairdressers Christian hairdressers club or something like that. Like how
Yeah.
would you do the job differently? And but I mean, the arts are different in the sense that you tend to be dealing with big issues in one way or another, and you have some influence over people's thinking because um, if if somebody picks up a book that I've written, then they might have been doing one thing, and then they see my book, and then they're doing another thing, and I've made them change their mind. Like they're going to pick that up, and they pick this up, and then they're reading it. So that I've altered their use of time for however long it takes to read that chapter or that book, and each thing you say is sort of guiding their thinking in some way. So that there is I suppose, an additional responsibility that comes with being a communicator of any kind, which is not quite the same as if you're a plumber. People often use this sort of analogies of plumbers and things like that. So yeah, there is a responsibility.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much.
I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to ask. I mean,
Well, I don't have anything right now. If it gave me a minute, I'd probably think of a bunch of stuff too. Whatever.
yeah.
I probably just reheat my tea and have some more, but I guess we better
Do you
stop.
know? Do you know Lucy Shaw?
Hmm?
Have you come across Lucy Shaw's poems?
No, haven't yet. I'll
Oh,
check it out.
yeah. I mean, she's in her 90s now. She's still writing. She puts stuff up on Facebook, and she does it in such a natural way. It's Luci, Lucy Shaw,
Okay.
and she does it in such a natural way. Uh, Definitely Christian observations of life, but she deals with everything. It was just a kind of little tightening of the screw there and a little loosening of the screw there. You know, there's something different about her poems. You know, she reminds me of oh, Mary Oliver, that type of poetry. Do you know Mary Oliver?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, she's worth reading. She wasn't. She died, but she wasn't a Christian. But the,
Yeah.
her poems are very interesting to Christians, I think.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
Okay, well, check those out. Like, well, tell others to check those out. It's been
Okay.
just such a privilege. I might just call you one day if I want to talk some
Okay.
more.
Sure. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Please
it's been
do.
a great privilege to have you here today. And so thank you for sharing so candidly and openly with us.
Okay.
And for everyone joining in, I encourage you to drop a donation to Faith Arts so that we can continue to arrange more interviews with other fantastic people and buy one of Steve's books. Okay, and be sure to check out our other interviews, including with Rory Noland and Matt Hurd, or find other resources on our website that's available to our members at www.faitharts.org. If you haven't visited there recently, go do it. So thanks again, and you have a good
Thank
evening.
you.
And I will too. I'm going out for dinner now. Okay.
Okay. Thank
See
you.
ya.